Our next tree is American elm, which is Ulmus americana in the Ulmaceae family. American elm, just like slippery elm, which you'll learn later in the semester, is typically found on moister sites, but when we compare American elm to slippery elm, American elm is generally found along the drier types of those sites, whereas slippery elm is typically found a little bit closer to the river. And remember, you should always think about where you're standing when you're trying to identify a tree. The bark on American elm has interlacing ridges that have fairly shallow furrows, but if we flake off a piece, and you can hopefully see it, it has layers of bark that are described to be alternating light and dark, and we'll show you a picture because it's not super obvious here. They're alternating light and dark, and one way to remember that is like stripes on American flag. Red, white, dark light, dark light. The American elm twig is light brown, but it's always smooth. Remember, American elm twig is always smooth. Slippery elm twigs can start to have very fine red hairs, but American elm, always smooth. The bud on an American elm is described to be football shaped and chestnut brown. Later in the semester, we'll compare that to slippery elm, which is more rounded and almost jet black. So remember that American elm has a chestnut brown, football shaped bud. The leaf on American elm is broadly ovate. Remember, the key thing to remember about elms is that they have this unequal base. So one side of the leaf, where it meets the petiole, is raised further than the other side, so it's unequal. The leaf margin on American elm is doubly serrate, and remember that all of our native elms have a doubly serrate margin. Chinese elm has a singly serrate margin. The fruit, the seeds on an American elm are a samara. So remember, key things about American elm: where it's at, always think about where you're at. Typically a little bit drier site than a slippery elm, so you typically won't find an American elm directly next to a river. The bark has interlacing ridges. It's alternate, doubly serrate with an unequal lateral base, and a chestnut brown bud with a smooth twig. The last thing that I'll tell you about American elm is that when it's growing native in its native habitat, it will start to develop a vase-shaped form with drooping branches.